Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. I just wanted to remind everybody that there's been a room change. So this is experience with buyouts. If you're looking for beyond to stay or move, that's next door. So we'll get started in just a minute. And next we have Gerrard Enriquez from Cornell University.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and glad to be here. Hi, so I'm a PhD student at Cornell, PhD candidate, and what I'm presenting today is part of my dissertation research on flood buyouts here in upstate New York, or well, in upstate New York primarily, but all throughout New York State. Okay, so we're here at this conference because many of us are asking, how should local governments protect, or who should local governments protect, and how should they distribute limited resources? I'm not going to argue about what is limited, what is not limited today, but we're consistently seeing in headlines sort of either or dilemmas of, do we protect wealthy homeowners who have access to environmental amenities, or do we protect sort of the masses? Do we protect the public interest or the interest of property rights? And we're seeing different sort of approaches as governments sort of try to figure out how do we resort environmental how do we resort the built environment to accommodate environmental hazards? So managed retreat is not a new phenomenon, but demands and resistance for it do seem to be amplifying. So we have cases of, such as the image on the left of in Staten Island, of sort of successful cases now. But we do see, like the rigorous Google image search method, that not everyone is a fan of managed retreat. So both resistance and a lot of pressures. So there's two dilemmas that I think we've all sort of identified in all of these sort of excellent sessions that we've seen at this conference. One is how to structure an empowerment-driven agenda for retreat. Usually this is enacted through rebuilding processes and reconstruction after a disaster. But we have to think about how do we do this as people resettle. And also how to negotiate consent without unevenly privileging some groups at the expense of justice and equity. So, first of all, an empowerment process is something that is self-affirming. It reclaims cultural commitments and is an act of resistance. So, normally after a disaster, the rhetoric that we hear is about sort of building back. We build back better. We're stronger than the storm. We're resilient. And this is a very self-affirming mentality that we need to heal from the trauma of the event. It naturally lends itself more towards reconstruction, rather than sort of dissipation and dissolving a community. That ostensibly seems sort of inherently sort of unethical in a way. So that rhetoric is an issue. Also, rebuilding reclaims cultural commitments. A lot of times we have sort of rational conceptions of risk. We judge others in other geographies. Maybe not you, but what some people do is they judge others and say, why do they take on this inherent risk? They knew the risk, deal with it. But it's not that easy. You have social and you have cultural capital, and you need to maintain that capital. You can't duplicate a lot of your cultural capital in another location. Finally, it's an act of resistance. So consistently after disasters, certain beachside communities, more privileged communities, are able to rebuild, finance repetitive risk properties. The government enables them. So if I'm not in that position, I expect the government to be able to accommodate myself the way that it's accommodated more privileged people. And I think I can demand that. So if we decide to retreat, how do we negotiate consent? So recovery groups traditionally are enacted through recovery regimes that unevenly privilege some groups at the expense of justice and equity. A lot of this is because of the fact that federal buyout policies require property home ownership and no outstanding debts. And that's a really important piece to the federal buyout policy. So that's inherently exclusionary. Millions of people live in flood zones that are not homeowners, that are at high risk, or that may be homeowners but have outstanding debts. So they're excluded from policies the way that they are right now. Now, as planners, I come from a planning background. We try to decide how do we use existing policies to sort of redistribute benefits to help those that may be more marginalized economically, socially, culturally, et cetera. So what we see is this sort of inherent tension as we're thinking about retreats. And one particularly great sort of foundational model I've identified is from Yukihino et al. In 2017, who described voluntary buyouts as a mutual agreement model, where the government's enabling the retreat and the communities sort of participating, or individuals participating in the buyout, have sort of mutuality because they both benefit from the property acquisition. So on the community side, such as in Liz Kozlov's case for retreat, we see this excellent ethnography, how at the community side, going bottom up, there's collective action, there's social movements, and demands for sort of individual mobility. And that helps you sort of establish some empowerment through the process of participating in the buyout. On the public side, I've identified bricolage, public entrepreneurship, and progressive governance as what can sort of help you do or help public decision makers decide to support retreat. Because traditionally governments are under fiscal constraints, they desire fiscal savings. There's a lot of political benefits of avoidance because of the way the election cycle works. You need demonstrable projects, and that favors mitigation rather than long-term adaptation. And then there's uncertainty of actual risk. If you want to tell people they should move, there's a need to move. You want to be certain that that flood risk is severe. But FEMA's flood maps they don't take into account climate change predictions. Consistently, after the last few hurricanes, about 50% have been completely outside of flood zones for those who had substantive damage. So we have sort of imprecise and imperfect measurement of risk itself. So as we're sort of beginning these foundational stages of theorizing regimes for relocation, it's sort of easy to forget that managed retreat is one of many different sort of explanations for why people undertake environmental migration, whether that's forced or involuntary or voluntary. So in trying to situate it, I looked at a few measures of recovery regimes. So these should take into account the socio-spatial effects, the participation models, and your individual agency in both staying and leaving. For the sake of time, I won't detail this too much, but we can come back to that later. So what is a buyout? So the government buys property from the homeowner. I know many of us know this, but just in case. And the property is ultimately returned to nature. That's sort of the end goal. So in 2018, FEMA had purchased over 37,000 properties, and the other major program, HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, has acquired over 5,000 properties. And these, again, will escalate a lot because of Irma, Maria, Harvey, which are not taken into account in these numbers. So the buyout process, the president must declare a major disaster declaration after a storm or a flood. The local government or county approaches the homeowners. Usually there's 12 to 36 months, as indicated in the literature. When I get to the results, I'll show that that's not always the case. The homeowner vacates and gives the deeds to the local government, at which point later the home is demolished, and the buyouts must remain open space under FEMA. As I said again, there's two major programs. Here in upstate New York, they manifested in two different ways. So FEMA traditionally has a 75% federal, 25% state or local funding requirement. A lot of local governments do not have enough money for that 25%, which is why some of them don't participate. Sometimes the state provides assistance for them if requested, sometimes it does not. The other thing with FEMA is that they deem cost beneficial. So there's a cost benefit analysis component to the eligibility. Essentially what that cost benefit analysis must show is at the local level, it would be more expensive to keep having to provide emergency services and infrastructure over the long term than the taxes that you get back. So if a place is profitable, if there's a high concentration of wealth, it's difficult to demonstrate that you will lose money in the long term. So that excludes certain areas from FEMA program. As an alternative or supplement, HUD has the CDBG DR program for buyouts. These also enable acquisitions in some cases. So this is 90 to 100% federally funded, which is seen as appealing to a lot of governments. And there's a low and middle income requirement. Usually for the CDBG program, since it's a redevelopment focused program, that's 80%. After the major disaster declarations, it's been lowered. So after Sandy, it was about 50% for the New York metro area. So before and after, I'm just going to show some imagery of sort of the dramatic transformation, but this pales in comparison to the excellent documentary we all saw. So this is Staten Island. So you see this sort of impressive ruralization and renaturalization of the built environment here within New York City. Now, upstate, so the Enwell neighborhood in town of Union, 2006 had a really devastating flood for the Susquehanna River Valley. So this is a pretty much fully built out community. They underwent first round of buyouts after 2006. So as of 2011, which is before Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricane Irene hit New York, we see the effects of that first 2006 buyout program. Then more buyout programs. So in 2019, it's pretty much about half of the size, which if you think about within the context of 13 years, that's a pretty dramatic transformation. And at the parcel level, you see a lot of different sort of vacant spots. So this is what a site or looks like. So just, I want one positive example of ecological change. I don't have that for New York State right now. But the ecological potential after a buyout, here's an example from Minnesota. And it's just sort of envisioning what do we do with the land after. So you can have habitat restoration and community garden, but a lot of times these processes take many, many years. So I'm curious, within this New York State, I have some research questions. One is, did New York Rising enable local governments to better address the social and ecological recovery gaps of federal buyout programs? And secondly, what characterizes entrepreneurial recovery regimes? How do their planning practices influence disaster recovery outcomes? And that image was a proposed relocated site for the village of Sydney. So methods, interviews, I created a buyout database, plan and policy review from the data sources that you see on the right. Case selection, there were 48 local governments in 10 counties that participated in the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program planning process and completed buyout projects, not necessarily New York Rising state buyouts though. So 35 local governments used FEMA for buyouts, 13 jurisdictions used state buyout program. Not all of them completed all of the projects, though. And finally, 8 communities allowed for a cross-case analysis. So I'm going to show where I sort of targeted the interviews and the sites for comparison were in these 8 communities. So acquisitions, again, you could theoretically rebuild. Buyouts, you cannot rebuild, if determined. So the relational context, there are 2 of those 8 that were particularly interesting for sort of understanding the dynamics of what local institutions, particularly with strong capacity constraints, like financial, technical capacity constraints, what you can do to have a sort of a successful buyout program. These were Sydney and the town of Union, which are in neighboring counties, Delaware and Broome County. So the household trends is we see from 2011 to 17, New York State, sort of the counties as a whole did recover somewhat economically. Within these particular contexts, there was not a full recovery. Negative is bad. So as a reminder, New York Rising was sort of this sort of exciting central agency for coordinating this actually incredibly complex, like multi-agency, multi-scalar process of the buyout program. So back to the question, did it enable local governments to better address social and ecological recovery gaps? Yes, primarily for 2 reasons. One is that the New York Rising program utilized a managed participation approach that helped with the production of recovery plans. Secondly is that effective administration depended on entrepreneurial disaster governance. That second of which I believe was really, really critical, as well as pre-event planning for the success of the buyout sites. So more on the state commitment to managed participation. What does this mean? When we envision participation, we do think locally. But the state knew that a lot of the problems that people have historically had at the local scale were because there was sort of a lack of we don't have sort of institutionalized regional environmental management programs for disaster recovery. So there's a lack of technical capacity in a lot of locations. So the state went in to provide that. So it provided bottom-up participatory approaches with top-down supervision and funding. So at the local level, local responses are bricolage. So bricolage is a concept. It's been used a lot by sort of different development scholars, sociologists, et cetera, for describing how local institutions or institutional actors can realize sort of affected or goals that they have despite sort of limitations in coordination processes or resources. So in the context of disaster recovery, I argue that bricolage is catalytic. It allows you to envision programs or projects that you need. And you begin the conceptual development and start beginning these processes to piece together a climate adaptive neighborhood. There are 2 examples in the state. There's also public entrepreneurship, which is more about sort of institutionalizing practices where you have sort of local autonomy and a desire to leverage multiple resources. And again, pre-event planning was critical. So institutional entrepreneurialism in this context, there were 4 particular innovations that I sort of discovered that both of these towns used. One is they were really forging collaborative networks, as evident in intermunicipal regional planning and information building and exchange. A lot of that happened informally, but is pretty well somewhat institutionalized despite its informality. Visionary plans for renaturalization. So a really forward-looking agenda for what to use or what to do with the sites, but not only the sites, but how they integrate with other sort of ecological change goals that they have for the community to become more climate resilient. Equitable social recovery. So the CDBG funding in this context, luckily, well, I shouldn't say luckily, that's a personal bias, sorry, but it was not used just to rebuild single-family housing. They primarily targeted seniors and low-income housing. And they built mixed-income or mixed-use, mixed-income developments with that CDBG funding for the acquisitions. They also acquired foreclosures and rezoned into open space for those who for the foreclosures within the buyout sites, because they, again, because the federal eligibility criteria do not qualify for the buyout if you get a foreclosure. Finally, they integrated with non-recovery environmental and housing projects. So local innovations could not solve the lengthened recovery process associated with governmental interdependence and losses of place-based capital. So this is, I think, why we're here, because we realize the real difficulties of implementation. And again, despite bricolage, despite public entrepreneurship, despite assistance from the state, there was sort of limitations in the positive outcomes because of the governmental interdependence. Most projects ended up taking about 5 years. So initially it's usually 1 to 3 in previous buyout projects, but this took a little bit longer. Part of that was because of an attempt to be a little bit more inclusive with the managed participation side as part of the program, and part of it was due to other factors as well. But lengthening the process, like really in-debt households. And it kind of forces the decision rather than allowing it to be purely voluntary. So what state policies could do is they could sort of think of more mandates to make the planning committees, in particular, more inclusive. This better and more inclusive deliberation is difficult within the time constraints of climate change and fatigue. So there was a lot of traction in the beginning stages, and when I say fatigue, I mean at the end they were exhausted. I asked a lot of basic questions about evaluating. I got a lot of really good tales of those beginning stages, but nothing done recently. Everyone is just done with it, emotionally exhausted from the exercise of the buyout project. In general, local recovery planning was enhanced rather than inhibited, so at least we didn't really see signs of autogestion, extreme self-reliance or self-management. So what went well? Well, the state policy framework matters. The state does have an influence. Local planning matters. Again, I had come from a planning background, and I know that seems really silly to say local planning matters, but it at least it does, because sometimes we create plans and they don't seem to matter. People do what they want. And many who wanted to leave did. The highest risk areas were mapped, updated. CDBG was used for more housing interventions for the more vulnerable residents in that locality, so that's a good thing. And thank you.
Thanks, Gerrard. And before we move on to the next one, I just want to invite anybody that's at the back of the room to come fill up some of the empty seats up here if you feel called to do so. And next we have Lily Verdone from the Nature Conservancy.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, but really thank you to Gerrard and Kevin, who did a lot of my presentation for me, so I don't have to explain Harris County, which is excellent. So no geographic reference needed there. I hope you all got that. And I don't have to go into depth about buyouts, so thank you so much. I am with the Nature Conservancy in Texas. I'm our Director of Freshwater and Marine, and we partnered about, actually right after Hurricane Harvey, we partnered with Texas A&M University to look at how to be more strategic with buyouts, and this is from the Nature Conservancy's point of view, so we're valuing nature and looking at it through the nature lens of not only how buyouts can be more strategic and proactive, but how they can be more of a value for both people and nature. So this is really just, the basics of it is that, we are continuing, this is the story across the United States and across the globe really, is that U.S. cities continue to grow. In Texas alone, by 2050, approximately, our population is expected to double, and that population is really heading to urban areas. And Harris County, which encompasses a really broad area, is home to Houston, which is, I think, the fourth largest city in the country right now. And so you're seeing a really diverse, populous area that is right in the path of these major hurricanes. And we're seeing hurricane damage, but also just seeing floods on a regular basis. I mean, we've had flooding over the last few weeks with these storms that just is coming in from regular rain events now that are more ongoing. So the idea that you have areas like Harris County that are seeing these continual storm events, are getting flooded out, and you have hundreds of thousands of homes that are on the list to be bought out, but not the funds to be bought out. So how do we be more strategic, more proactive, and really think about it also with nature in mind? So thinking about how these buyouts can act better ways to create more resilience for the communities, filter more flood water, and become more helpful to vulnerable locations. And so we put some thought into that and looked at how to really think about, what matters to us as a Nature Conservancy, what matters to the communities, and how to be more proactive to really think about identifying flood-prone properties for acquisition and restoration in advance of storms, and how do we do that, and how do we do that in a way that makes sense both financially and for the communities. So Harris County, as was mentioned earlier, is really the leader in the country right now for buyouts, and they're doing a great job. I mean, hands down to Harris County Flood Control District, they're working really hard, and they've taken it a step above and beyond just looking at properties that have been flooded, but they're looking at how to do acquisitions in a way that makes sense to their community. They just Harris County just passed this amazing bond on the year anniversary of Harvey, where there's now billions of dollars to go into this type of work, and that was approved through a voter initiative, and it got 85% approval rating, which is really unheard of. And so you're thinking about these, hearts and minds are being changed now. So how do we keep that going and keep moving forward? So again, Harris County is doing some really good work right now, but what they're doing is they're looking at the current floodplain, and so they're looking at buyouts within the current floodplain. And as we saw from the maps earlier, these properties are getting flooded, inside the current 100-year floodplain, outside the floodplain, and we need to really think about updating that and thinking about being more functional and flexible on how we do that work. So with that thought in mind, we started to think about, okay, so how do we then make that sense and make that case and look at both the economics of it and then an actual driver and create a roadmap for communities to use like Harris County. And so what matters to us as the Nature Conservancy is looking at how to really cluster properties. And so what we did is we thought about, well, if you have buyout properties, how can we cluster and make bigger properties? So we're eliminating that reactive approach. We're eliminating the factor of getting a checkerboard pattern across the city of small parcels. how do we combine them together? And so we created a model to look at distance to natural features, including distance to floodplains, wetlands, protected areas, parks, and other existing buyouts. And then we also looked at the additional factors like repetitive loss, and then social vulnerability is something that we also really care about and think that needs to be more transparency around that. And so we added that as an additional layer to our study. And we were lucky enough to partner with the Harris County Flood Control District. They gave us the data, the flood claims from Harvey. And so we had a really current data set of actual flooded properties to use on this. And so all that together, that was the model that we put together. That was the sausage making. What came out were eligible candidates for buyouts, and we were able then to do several different scenarios to look at what that looked like on the ground. So this just shows what we did. So if we ended up getting this really great database of NFIP claims that were directly from Harvey, so this was brand new from the Harris County Flood Control District, and so then that gave us the damages. If we didn't have that, we did some economics on it. I won't go into detail because that's not my job on that one. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them on that. But really what we came out was the damages of the property for each properties based on Harvey. So we were able to use a broad data set. And then we did a cost-benefit calculation, and so we looked at the total flood loss, so these Harvey claims, and then the historic flood claims, and then had that over the assessed market value, and that showed a benefit-cost ratio. And so anything that was higher than 1 indicated that the scenario would have a net financial benefit to the community. And so just remember that when we go through towards the end. So these are some of the measures that we use, and we ran different models. And so I'm just going to go into a couple of those different models and in this talk, and then this is going to be starting with business as usual. So we just talked about business as usual, really about how Harris County is doing models now. And so you can see that this is, the properties are in the floodplain. They have repetitive loss, yes, and it's riverine flooding. So check all those boxes. Harris County can go and they can buy the property. So you can see that even though with the bigger map, they're around areas that were within floodplains, when you get down to the parcel level, the existing buyouts, which are in blue, are also really adjacent to other damaged properties. So their neighbors could have been damaged, but they weren't eligible because they didn't fall into one of those criteria that Harris County uses. So this is then a scenario that we looked at. So this was all natural features and adjacency to buyouts. And so again, this is what matters to us as the Nature Conservancy. We want to see, we think that there's going to be a better, and there's data showing that there's better economic value when you have bigger areas to absorb more waters that create more resilience in communities. So that's what we want to see. We want to see more connectivity, even in urban areas. It makes a lot of sense. And so this is not the right way to do it, but this is one way to do it. And the beauty of tools like this and studies like this is that it can be a choose your own scenario. So if your community is interested in doing something similar, you can take the same methodology and plug in what it matters to your community. And so we plugged in what matters to us, and we came up with candidate buyouts that are really more clustered. And they're clustered adjacent to existing features, natural features like parks and open space. And so you can see here that this is, the blue are existing buyouts, the red are candidate buyouts, so eligible, and then the black are other eligible. So in our model, it shows a clustered approach that all those can be prioritized. And so you can look across the board, across Harris County, and really think about, okay, well, if you have hundreds of thousands of homes that are on the list to be bought out and really want to be voluntarily bought out, what makes the most sense if you only have X amount of dollars in the bank? What makes the most sense for your community? What makes the most sense for flood control, social aspects, environmental aspects, all those things across the board. So I'll just show one more scenario. And this is adding the social vulnerability lens, which is, extremely important. We've been talking about it the last few days. Kevin talked about it specifically about Harris County, and this is something that, we need to be more transparent about in our decision-making process. And so if you add social vulnerability to the same model, adding, all ecological features, adjacency to buyout, adding social vulnerability, you get, even more scaled down approach. And so if you look across Harris County, you can see how important this is. So the light pink in the map show socially vulnerable neighborhoods. And so a lot of these areas the majority fall in socially vulnerable areas. So we need to have all this looking through this lens across the board, have all the right decision makers and community members at the table when we're making these decisions. Again, it's what is right for the community. And so this is just one example of how we can work and how we can work together to do these things together and spend the money in a way that makes sense both for nature and for people. So going back to the cost-benefit analysis, you can see that anything above 1, as I mentioned before, is a cost-benefit. And so what we're looking at is really across the board, the takeaway was clear, is that doing more buyouts strategically and with nature in mind is just as cost-benefit as the traditional approach, but you're getting these stacked benefits. So you're getting additional benefits for flood risk reduction, open space protection, enhanced community living, and resilience as well. And so there's not a negative towards looking at a broader approach, a more proactive approach. And so the summary is really just that same idea, is that business as usual in Harris County is above and beyond. I mean, they're doing a really good job, but adding a proactive lens on it and thinking about how we can really scale up and think about how to use nature, how to invoke the community that's living in these areas to get a better approach is even a more streamlined way to do it, and you can get that approach and have more benefits for both people and nature. And, just as to wrap up, really, the idea is that, you have strategic buyouts, and we're thinking about these things on a broad area. We can do it with different lenses, through nature, through social, through stacked benefits. But really what we need to do is think about how smart public policy actions can help kind of translate these results on the ground. And so there's a lot of different ways that we need to think about doing that, and really the funding source is the key piece here. And I mean, we need to think about prioritizing buyout investments across the board and thinking about how to do it in a better way, in a way that we can do prioritized work as opposed to reactive work. And thinking about how we can really move these approaches better so you can get better decisions on the ground for both the ecological and social benefits without sacrificing that bottom line of the economics. And so this is really pushing those state, federal, local investments, making sure that we do more things like the Harris County flood control bond that was passed last year, or just in this last November in Austin, where my hometown right now, we just passed $149 million to open space and parks and $184 million to flood mitigation. And so that's thinking those funds are going to be spent on the ground, not only for buyouts, but also to transition buyout properties, to think about how we can use them in the interim for things like pocket prairies and community parks and bike paths, and so what's needed for the community, and really have an integrated approach so we have people who live in the communities participating in how those lands should be used. And I think that I will just stop there. And I would be happy to share, we have a report that we've done, and my partners at Texas A&M are really helpful, and so I'd be happy to share any of this information. We have the raw data as well, so feel free to contact me, and thank you.
Great. And last, we have Peter Mattingly from NYU. I don't know that we received that. This is the PDF version, huh?
Hello. Perfect. Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending. My name is Peter Mattingly from NYU. I'll be addressing the experience with buyouts by talking about the relationship between flood-prone real estate and areas where governments bought out flood-damaged residential properties from voluntary homeowners. To prove how ineffective last-minute relocation and flood planning is, part of me wants to wait until I have 5 minutes left to begin speaking. I'll save that for another day. I do want to preface that this is part of an ongoing research project of mine with a paper that is forthcoming, so all feedback and vicious remarks emailed privately is much appreciated. Specifically today I'll be focusing on the changes in real estate values before and after residential properties were bought out in New Jersey and New York due to Sandy. As we've heard past 2 days, Sandy struck the coast, resulting in extensive damage and unprecedented need for disaster recovery assistance in affected communities, and exposed the risks. Even living within an urban center as we do still live in a flood-prone area with many socioeconomic, physical vulnerabilities concerning different populations, and facing the long-term challenges of adapting to sea level rise. We continue to bear witness to flood-prone areas, particularly along the coast, as they continue to grow into both emerging hotspots of global sea level rise and increasingly attractive real estate markets. In spite of headline grabbing and nuisance flooding, an estimated 41 million people, or 13% of the U.S. population, still live within a 100-year floodplain. And by 2050, these estimates are expected to increase to about 60 million people due to continued development, and 1.8 trillion worth of assets to be exposed to saltwater intrusion, heavier precipitation events, more powerful storm surges, and coastal erosion exacerbated by sea level rise. Some blame the trend and the $20 billion debt of the NFIP because of the moral hazard created by requiring flood-prone homeowners to have flood insurance through their federally regulated mortgage lenders, but then subsidizing that insurance so that the actual risk is not felt. Having flood insurance to rebuild with little precaution and remaining unconvinced of the imminent threat posed by climate change may leave homeowners with a false sense of security and no incentive before or after a natural disaster, apart from the same old tired tactics. So within the realm of inundation management, response, and recovery, one of the increasingly more common pathways toward resiliency and response includes property buyouts. Here we can see between 1989 and 2017 the number of FEMA-funded bought-out properties of primary owner residence properties by their affiliated hurricane. Floyd's buyouts were the largest in history up until Harvey, followed by Sandy, Fran, Irene, and Katrina. And the vast majority of these buyouts took place in North Carolina, Jersey, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and New York. It's a really pretty graph, so take a picture. Beautiful. So as a form of quote-unquote managed retreat and alternative structural offenses like seawalls or repealed flood insurance policies like bigger waters, buying out properties is the process of transitioning certain populated neighborhoods and housing areas to their natural non-residential state. And the process for relocating such areas through buyouts, however, complexities are abound. While there are some upsides we can appreciate, buyouts provide homeowners a pathway out of repeatedly flooded or increasingly vulnerable properties, and upon removal of the property itself may enable the land to improve drainage and lower risk of flooding for the surrounding area. And for buyouts to feasibly provide a pathway towards retreat depends on key factors in the municipality and the locality, including political and public support, financial technical resources, affluence, especially given the incredible length of time it takes for a homeowner to get approved for a buyout, as well as typography, hydrology, ecosystem, zoning, and land use, built environment, natural resources, tourism, navigation, and the presence of other hazards. Due to limited funding, however, not all properties can be bought out, and a myriad of competing properties and strict criteria determine a homeowner's eligibility, such as flood risk determined by the NFIP. Moreover, because buyout programs largely apply only to homeowners and are predicated on the establishment of market value, buyouts may disadvantage quote-unquote holdouts or the group who remains behind in the community, including renters, those who do not own a home, or those homeowners of properties with lower pre-disaster market values, which, if offered in the form of a buyout, would not provide them sufficient enough means to relocate. So in relation to housing markets, previous research has addressed concerns over natural hazards like flooding, vulnerability to flooding, and flood insurance costs, and those impacts on property values. Concerning buyouts, literature suggests that buyouts can aim to improve market values of neighborhoods surrounding those buyout municipalities. The most ideal version of this is when an entire neighborhood accepts the buyout offer and moves out of the neighborhood. This allows developers to transform the land into something flood mitigating and recreationally beneficial to the surrounding community. Utilizing proximity to buyout properties as a proxy for perceived risk of potential natural hazard, my hope is to eliminate what happens when you get left behind, potentially, and contribute further insight to the literature observing averages in real estate values and flood insurance policy before and after, immediately in the 2 years after the buyouts took effect in New York and New Jersey, and comparing participating and non-participating municipalities. So jumping right into the fun. Beginning in 2013, the New York Rising Buyout Program began buying out single-family residences affected by Sandy and acquired over half of approximately 140 of those buyouts in Staten Island, specifically in neighborhoods of Oakwood Beach, Ocean Breeze, and Grand Breeze. Quick note following the figures, these are descriptive findings and not in this context meant to promote causality, so embrace what they are. Here we go. So as far as policy count, taking this before and after and between approach, we can observe trends in flood insurance. As far as the number of flood insurance policyholders, we see a 34% decrease in the average number of policies in zip codes that had no buyouts and a 42% decrease in zip codes that had buyouts. This could be due to other aspects related to these zip codes in addition to those policyholders no longer living there, such as residents paying off their mortgage and not volunteering to have flood insurance anymore. In terms of costs, we see within 2 years after Sandy a 42% decrease in the average cost of flood insurance policy in these zip codes with no buyouts and a 65% decrease in zip codes with buyouts. We can speculate what's behind these decreases, whether it's related to buyouts no longer living there or the benefits of buyouts mitigating flood risk. Again, this is for the immediate understanding or the immediate time frame following Sandy. In terms of market values, as far as the average market value of properties calculated by the jurisdictional tax assessing officer, we see a 9% increase in average market value by square foot in zip codes in Staten Island with no buyouts, but a 39% increase in average market values in zip code with buyouts. Because these buyouts are close in proximity to the coastline and now there being fewer houses available there for purchase, this market value might reflect the decrease in supply and anticipated demand for those properties deemed potentially safe because they weren't bought out. However, when we look at these homes and what they're actually selling for, or what the current property owner paid for the property, we see a fairly consistent figure with the average market value figure at 7% increase in average last sale values for non-buyout zip codes, though we see an 18% decrease in average last sale values in zip codes with buyouts. Again, I reiterate, I'm not attempting to prove something causal, and this discrepancy between these two different types of sales is only an opportunity for further investigation. So leaving New York for a hot second, and going to the least PowerPoint compatible state I know, New Jersey. So we can see the distribution of the number of buyouts by county, where the concentration really relies in the middle of the state here in Middlesex and Somerset counties. Beginning in 2013, the Blue Acres buyout program started to buy out and effectively acquire properties from voluntary homeowners. As of 2013, this would be the largest statewide buyout program in history. Since 2013, Blue Acres has bought out 168 single-family residences in Middlesex, the largest of any New Jersey county. And going into the same flow with Staten Island, So we can see following the same structure, we can see in Middlesex, zip codes without buyouts, there was a 33% decrease in the number of policies, and zip codes with a buyout had a 60% decrease. This follows similar trends with what we saw in Staten Island, although New Jersey zip codes without buyouts, this decrease is much larger. As far as policy costs, we see a 29% decrease in average flood insurance policy costs for zip codes without, and a 56% decrease for zip codes with buyouts, which is fairly parallel to what we also saw in Staten Island. Going into market values, in terms of average market values, again calculated by the tax assessing officer, we see a 1% increase in this figure in zip codes without buyouts and a 15% decrease in average market values for zip codes with bought out properties, which contrasts the suggested trends in Staten Island, partly because I believe that most of Middlesex is landlocked and does not have as much coastline as Staten Island, potentially explanation why there would be such a drastic difference. And then as far as what homeowners are actually paid for these properties, in terms of average last sale values or the amount that the property actually sold for, we see similar trends with average market values, a 1% increase in zip codes without buyouts, and a 14% decrease in these values for zip codes with bought out properties. And so although they had the most number of properties bought out by their state and each had a fairly same number, Middlesex and Staten Island differ in many respects, particularly miles of coastline. We can see some indication that zip codes with and without buyouts are paying less, and perhaps due to further analysis on particularly why, looking into more of the typography and landscape, this could be revealed. And as a matter for continuing future research, taking into account additional risk of living in these flood-prone areas, the socio-physical and economic characteristics of different neighborhoods and populations. And while we urge to promote inclusivity and prevent maladaptation, if on a pathway towards buyouts, I urge the same for how the government handles its data and makes it accessible in a way that doesn't leave me late nights practicing my B. Arthur impression, while cleaning up the messy misspellings of the phrase Department of Environmental Protection in 60 million lines of code. So thank you, and I'll be around for questions later.
So I'll have all the presenters stay and come back up here. And I think just to start, I'll see if there are any immediate questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Hi, yes. My name is Nicole Harris. I work for an organization called New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. My question is not about New Jersey, though. We belong to a coalition, a national coalition called the Moving Forward Network, which is communities that are most impacted by goods and freight. We belong to other people who belong to this coalition are from around the nation, including Houston. I had the opportunity to visit Houston about 6 months before Harvey and do a toxic tour. And so when you talk about retreating or relocation, what is happening with these fossil fuel industry and these oil refineries, which look like the zombie apocalypse? And I was told and confirmed that some of the Terminator movie was recorded at one of those. And that's the first thing I said when I saw the oil refineries. This looks like a Terminator movie. And they said, oh, one of them was recorded here. So I would like to know, as they're relocating human beings, what are they doing about these industries in a place where there's no zoning laws, like Houston has no zoning, and the county is doing all of this stuff, but what are they doing substantively? Basically.
I can take that. Is it on? Yeah. There you go. Yeah, that's a really good question, not only for Houston, but for across the United States and really globally. the Nature Conservancy, we are just right now developing out a more robust coastal program across the state of Texas that I'm leading. And so one of the things that we're going to be looking at more deeply is critical infrastructure along the coast. And we've been doing a lot of this work in California and other places in the United States, and the ports are a really big player in that as well. But the idea that there is critical infrastructure in sea level rise zones that's being impacted now, in hurricane zones that's being impacted now, in flood zones that are being impacted now, with the impacts of climate change or without the impacts of climate change, is really important. I mean, it's an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue, it's just a societal issue that we see constantly. And I think that I don't have an answer for it, but it is something that I'm personally really interested in and been looking into. And we've done some work with Department of Defense in California on similar issues. We've been looking at EPA Superfund sites, which are in coastal zones as well. So it is such a huge suite and body of work that it really needs to be looked at across the board. And I think in places like Texas, where the zoning is not the best, if there at all, we need to be thinking about how else to get the work done. And that could be through non-traditional partnerships, working with the owners of these facilities, and thinking about, a lot of them right now are thinking about how to create more sustainable practices within their businesses. So how do you work with an oil manufacturer or a Superfund site owner or a power plant operator to think about, what does your property look like in the next 10, 15, 20, 100 years? What is the long-term plans for the facility? What can we be doing to work collaboratively to make that happen and make it a benefit not only for them economically, but also just for the community at large?
Just a quick follow-up. But when does it get to a tipping point where these industries no longer become viable? When you have a map where you show with Houston with the water all throughout the entire area, where does it become a urgent enough matter to say you can't be here anymore because you're destroying everything?
Yeah, I think that we haven't got there yet, which is unfortunate. I mean, and what it's been is that it's been right now has been that putting up walls and actually doing physical modifications. But I mean, we were working in California on very similar issues and looking at the flooding in a lot of these places. It's not necessarily the actual structure that's going to be the one that's going to be hit most. It's going to be the surrounding infrastructure. So how do they get their employees to the site because there's no roads, or the roads are closed 90% of the year, or how do they get the electric back and forth? And so I think that's going to be more of the driver in my experience than them actually them being impacted, because really we can put a lot of concrete in front of a plant and say that it's going to be okay for a while, but really thinking more holistically and trying to work with those owners and the community around to get critical movement there and get voices heard is important.
Just to expand on that question for a moment, I think part of what I heard in your question too was you're working in a community that has a cultural resistance to zoning. And so and this can be for Kevin or Lily, but how do you talk about buyouts in that cultural setting?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, since I'm going, I'll just keep going. I don't know if it's necessarily a cultural resistance to zoning. I think that a lot of Texans would be fine with zoning, but it's just about framing it and having the correct way. We are working with communities along the coast on the CRS program, the community rating system, which is, we heard someone was talking about it earlier today, which is it incentivizes communities to do things like increase zoning for better resilience, to save open space for natural infrastructure. And then it's a FEMA program, and so communities actually get flood insurance discounts, and you see it on your flood insurance bill, community rating system discount score. And so you can have that issue, or you can have that kind of visual connection with that. My community is doing X, Y, and Z to help with creating more resilient landscape, and so I'm getting an economic benefit through my flood insurance. One thing that is a big points indicator for the CRS program is having better zoning. And so in Texas, the coastal communities who are participating in CRS cannot fully gain all of the CRS points because of that. So it's just about making it known and bringing up these types of facts. So I don't think necessarily, I think that it's something that has happened, but not necessarily something that people would be against.
Oh, sorry, Kevin, did you want to?
Is this on? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I would just, so with the caveat that I'm not a policy maker or expert, but just as someone, as a sociologist who's been studying it, I mean, it seems to me that in the absence of strong regional planning, from what we're seeing in Houston just with the last 2 decades of buyouts, that it's unlikely that they're going to have any real impact on adaptation in Houston. My feeling on zoning is that it is probably, I think the real estate industry in Houston is so powerful that I think, and this is sort of the political sacred cow in the city, that I think it's almost impossible to envision a world. I mean, right after Harvey, the mayor said, you know, because there was, you know, some commentary that perhaps zoning would have mitigated the devastation, that Houston would have been a city with zoning that had flooded. And so the idea that unchecked urbanization had anything to do with the scope of Harvey, that's not on the table at an official level. And when we're seeing, and so I didn't go into this with sort of the map of what, so there may be a general pattern that we're seeing just with our data of people moving to sort of the northwestern suburban areas of the county, and that's creating, you know, worse flooding. As urbanization intensifies upstream, it intensifies downstream problems. So because the buyouts are being framed, you know, by the federal government, by the local government in this hyper-individualized, market-friendly way, there's not a real sense of, well, what happens after this? And I think if people are taking buyouts and then creating more urbanization, more development upstream, what's really being solved? So I'm very skeptical that Houston is going to be a place that's going to be, even with this bond issue, I mean, I'm very skeptical that they're going to be the city that solves climate change issues.
Hi, Alyssa Mann from the Nature Conservancy in California. And Gerrard, one of the things that popped out for me in your presentation was, you know, you showed kind of the potential if we restored or created community gardens or parks with some of these open lots. But from your presentation, it looked like that's not happening very often. And I'm curious kind of what you think the main barriers to be able to go that next step and actually get those stacked benefits that Lily was talking about in terms of, you know, both kind of livability and ecological value. And so I'm wondering what you think the main intransigence there is.
This is on? Oh, no, it's definitely not. Okay, yeah, so the post-buyout land use. And that's what actually really, really interested me in this project was, particularly New York Rising, is that they're facilitating all of these sort of front-end deals, so that should maximize outcomes on sort of the local back end of what they want to do with the sites. And I was thinking, we're going to see all this like habitat restoration plans and all these other things. And no. And there's a few reasons why. One is the funding runs out, and it doesn't fund those post-buyout land uses. The other is there's fierce determination to have that decided by the community members themselves. And it's not necessarily induced by local governments because I called it fatigue, but they're so exhausted after administering the programs that they don't really even want to introduce sort of significant and very specific programming at the sites themselves. But they will do that if the community members sort of demand it, which they usually don't, or at least they haven't yet. In the example, that's part of the reason why I gave that one example from Minnesota that seemed out of place, is that was done like, I guess maybe like less than 10 years ago, and that was from the 1993 flood. So, and that was like a good 15, 16-year process where the remaining community members were like, oh, okay, we need to do something with these sites or with these lots. And I think there's a lot of optimism because of sort of best practice sharing by local governments that it'll eventually come. And there's a lot of waiting, but they really expect that to be bottom up. which is both good and bad. I think they need to start envisioning a little bit more, or try to induce it a little bit more, but they won't until there's more funding.
Yeah, I think this one's probably for Kevin. My question, or my interest, is this perceived idea of, or this perception that lost property rates, or taxes as you guys call them over here, is an inhibitor of implementing managed retreat programs. And some of the research that I've done in Australia is that talking to local governments there, some of these residential and particularly low density population areas actually are cost negative areas for local governments to maintain and service. And then when you add on emergency services to that, it may not be such an inhibitor. Do you have any thoughts on that? And are your findings saying that there was 70% of people are relocating within their municipalities? So do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. So it's nice. So what we found is that 90% are staying within the metro area. So it's a very, at least for now, it's sort of remaining a local process. And I think what you're getting at is an interesting question for the future, where like some of those services may become cost prohibitive in the future. Will that result in people moving out of the Houston area? And so far, it seems like people are willing to stay, and because of things like this bond issue, I think there's probably some sense of hope that there will be infrastructural improvements that will allow people to kind of remain in the city. But I don't know that I can really speak to all the aspects of your question, but that just would be my kind of quick thought.
I would just add that I think within these areas that are definitely the urbanized areas where we're seeing more and more people moving to them, no matter what the flood aspect is. It's just about the smart planning, and I think that cities like Houston are slowly coming around to that. Is that we need to accommodate for the people who are coming in. At the same time of becoming more resilient, because a lot of the, in the communications with the Harris County Flood Control District and other decision makers on the ground, it's the cost of, obviously, the properties and the damage, but it's human lives. It's the first responders coming in to help people out over and over again in the same places, and so it's costly. The emergency services is costly. All types of storms are costly in a lot of levels, and so if we can get fewer and fewer people in those damage areas out, but keep them in the city, I mean, that is through smart planning.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is probably a question for Lily, but I thought your the attempt to sort of more holistically optimize buyouts for natural resource values and alongside flood damage avoidance was really interesting, but I was struck by the lack of the ecosystem service valuation within that. Have you thought about including or broadening the cost benefit ratio to include those other values, as an additional input to the?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, this is the study on this is a really simple study. I mean, and we took advantage of coming right up after Hurricane Harvey and really kind of jumped on that to not only do something that was novel and that hasn't been done before, but do it in a really simple, straightforward way that can show decision makers that it doesn't have to be a challenge. But yeah, you can add in things like ecosystem services. We have a lot of data, and the Nature Conservancy broadly has been working to advance that body of work on ecosystem services, both in the Gulf and globally. And so that's something. Another thing that we were thinking about is that our study did not show what the flood retention value is of clustered versus non-clustered, and so that's something too that we would love to do. I don't know personally if it makes the case more for decision makers like planners or policy makers, because I think it's pretty visual to show. That if you have cluster buyouts and it costs the same to get stacked benefits, I mean, you're pretty much that's a good argument right there. But just because it's something that I'm interested in and would love to do, and I know my co-authors would like to do, that's something that we could see taking as a next step. But I think just doing a lot of times we get stuck in that analysis paralysis, and we don't really need to make decisions on the ground. We can just do something pretty straightforward and have, a really nice, clean set of data that shows us a direction that we could go, or like I've said in my talk, that we could use it as, a choose your own adventure, and you plug in what you want to plug in. So.
I think one of the underappreciated aspects of buyouts is that it might be the largest investment in open space protection our government has ever made. And so, sort of really optimizing that outcome for natural resource values might be worthwhile doing.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
I'd like to actually just add one caveat to this, because that's wonderful and that's the original approach. And then sort of later in the research, I realized that, people with risk are dispersed, and there's an economies of scale and sort of a romanticization of what can happen when you do restoration or ecological projects that are beneficial. So you look for, because we target these areas primarily by looking at concentrated households that are vulnerable next to amenity areas. And this is like what's informing the way local governments are deciding who's eligible. And that's it basically for those who are vulnerable that are not concentrated, that are dispersed, they're not going to be targeted by that local government, and a buyout won't happen for them. And the other thing I'd like to say is this reliance on, it's both of what could be that's ecological, and it's also past basically FEMA's maps. And what we've seen from all of these hurricanes is about 50% of those with substantial damage are outside of the flood zones. So this is why I'd like the question from Nicole from New Jersey is that I think we need to have a more environmental justice-oriented approach to giving primacy to the flood buyout criteria, because a lot of people, particularly in Houston, probably have had exposure to this high concentration of Superfund effluents that went through, polluted it. It's probably not safe, and they probably may not qualify for a buyout because they're not concentrated in a potentially restorable, I guess, habitat or in the flood zone. So millions are excluded, in the U.S. that probably should be, that are exposed to environmental toxins, et cetera. So I love the primacy with ecological restoration, but it's sort of these benefits to persuade us are also realizing, and I say this because when I did the buyout research, I included a lot of sites before 2011 and in 2006, and in the 1990s when they first introduced them, New York State, a lot of them would just do 1 to 3 sites or 1 to 3 properties. And that seemed to stop completely in 2011. It was only larger sites that were done, and few local governments were just doing 1 or 2. Almost none of them just did 1 or 2. So I think it's because in these sort of exchange networks, they're beginning to target the homes because they're looking for this concentration of scale. So they're not accommodating really single-digit numbers of households that are dispersed that need it anymore.
And if I can add to that, I definitely appreciate and like the optimism about sort of what buyouts could become as sort of sites of nature and sort of returning them to open space. I would just say, just as a sort of and I didn't present any visual data on this, but just from seeing what buyout sites have become in Houston, there's incredible variation. And so and because of the checkerboard effect that's been mentioned, I think certainly to the dismay of the policymakers, there's not, there are very few places within Houston where there's been able to, build a new park out of, buying out an entire block. And more often it is these sort of one-off properties that, really get left to the neighborhood to decide or not decide, and I think that's where sort of local social capital and other kinds of economic resources come into play. And so, if you go into poorer neighborhoods in Houston and you go to buyout sites, they can become dumping grounds, right? They're not necessarily any kind of an ecological amenity. You go into a wealthier neighborhood, it might be maintained as almost a little free little park. So I think because of the sort of the framing of the policy, it is going to remain, unless it changes, it's going to remain so sort of localized and individualized that I think it's going to be difficult, I think, in the current structure, at least in Houston, to kind of achieve the sort of thing that you would, and I would certainly like to see.
I saw 2 hands, so maybe let's take both questions at the same time, and then we can have answers.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, you spoke to it earlier, but I just wanted to see if you could expand on, when you talk about buyouts and then you're talking about neighborhoods where you might even be getting people who are gentrified out of one neighborhood moving into another neighborhood, or just a history of environmental justice in that neighborhood and redlining as you spoke to. And now you're talking about manage retreat and having that conversation with people who may not feel empowered to leave for various reasons. Like, how do you facilitate that discussion? I live in Staten Island, right? So I know there's a lot of talk about Mid Island and South Shore and these communities that brought out. They were in the only areas that were affected by the flood, right? A lot of underreporting happened as well. And there were reasons for that. So I just wanted you to if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Did you want to take another question?
Yeah, do you want to voice your question?
So my question is for Peter. Is it Peter on the end? Hi, Peter. I thought your presentation was really fascinating, and one of the things we've been doing recently is a line of research looking at the impacts of buyout programs on the households in the immediately surrounding areas, so people who weren't included but who were impacted directly. And these concerns about losses in their home values play so prominently in their experiences and kind of feed into their recovery, generally not so positively is what we're seeing. It seems like your research is kind of confirming their concerns. So my question for you is what do you think we should do with this data? Right, it's really interesting. I think it's important. How do we take this information and use it in a way that might eventually be beneficial or helpful to people making decisions in buyout zones or the surrounding areas? Thanks.
So I guess I'll answer the first question. So it's a great question. I think a sort of justice framing is really absent from a lot of this sort of top-down policy discourse. And so to give one small example, so a neighborhood in Houston, Cashmere Gardens, which is predominantly black, low income, and the county has tried to implement pretty significant buyouts in that neighborhood in the past, and there's been significant pushback, and understandably, given the sort of like the history of urban renewal and sort of forced movement of African Americans out of communities like that, and fears of the county wants to push us out to bring new white people in and build up, new, more valuable homes. And so when you're dealing with that kind of attention, I think it's incredibly complicated. And I think the problem with the policy as it stands is that there's no, and this is partly because it's a condition of federal funding. And so some states, like I know in Milwaukee, they do offer some relocation assistance, but because there's no real plan in place for what happens to folks after they're bought out, they're just left, to the whims of the housing market. I think that's the biggest thing that needs to be fixed when you're talking about a sort of a justice approach to the issue.
Hi. Okay. That is a great question. I would say that the actual original use suggested for that data set for my school was for business school students to really take a dive and see if they're ready to evaluate markets. It was never meant to be like for a policy student to really see and evaluate a problem of this magnitude. I would say that the data set that I had only went up to 2015, so I could only even understand the first 2 years following Sandy. And even then, an important thing is to know exactly when the buyouts actually took effect, because it's an ongoing process, and if there's still skepticism about where buyouts will be approved, that also needs to be taken into consideration for the model. I will say that with data set like this, geocoding is possible, so you can actually break it down and measure by distance and find the closest buyout property to your property, and be able to note if within entire communities whether or not your property, if there's some significant relationship between actual physical proximity or just existing within that same municipality, and that's also worthwhile pursuing as well. I would say keep in mind the government, as I was saying, doesn't keep the tidiest data. So working with addresses is particularly tumultuous and a journey we all go on individually. If you have any questions or need any help, guidance in that area, I'm more than happy to talk.
Well, thank you so much to all of our presenters, and if you're itching for a whole second panel on buyouts, you're in luck because there's another one at 3:30. So happy to continue this conversation.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel on legal aspects of managed retreat. My name is Michael Gerrard. I'm lucky enough to work in this building. I'm on the faculty of Columbia Law School, where I teach environmental law and energy law and direct the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. So we have 5 panelists this afternoon. The format, as with most of the other panels, is that each panelist will have 15 minutes to talk. If they finish early, we'll have time for questions directed at that panelist. If they don't, I'm the one guy who knows where the trap door is located. And then if we finish all of the discussions in advance, I'll ask all of the panelists to come up, and we'll take questions from you of any or all of them. We are slightly rearranging the order because Mark Davis needs to leave for the airport. And so I'm going to call on Mark first. Mark is the director of the Tulane Institute on Water Resources Law on Policy. And as you see, he's going to be talking about from words to deeds, managed retreat in the context of legal rights, duties, and responsibilities. Mark?
Thank you, Mike. Well, we made it. I've really enjoyed this conference, I've got to say, to hang out with people from multiple places, multiple disciplines. This is exactly the kind of thing that I was hoping for. I confess I was hoping that people would answer all of my questions that I have, and it turns out that it's harder than that. But that'll be the next conference. But one of the things that I think is worth talking about is how we do all these great discussions about retreat, restoration, resilience, sustainability, in the context of legal frameworks that, quite frankly, are ultimately going to determine what we can and can't do, and especially for how long we've got to do it. Let's see if one of these works. There we are. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. This is a picture of our coastal zone and what is projected to be in 50 years. So I just want you to know that for some people, retreat is conjectural. We live it. We already have communities that are retreating. We have communities that have retreated. We have things happening in our coast which are, probably not going to happen in most communities, but this is what sea level rise, climate change starts to bring to a landscape, a culture, and economy. And it's a fairly good place to start this conversation. The people who put this map together were focusing on land loss. When land turns into open water, because the land sinks or the seas rise or both. What those folks didn't really think about is, well, what do each of these dots represent? And that's what I want us to start thinking about, because this is a nice, kind of lens to look at how law, policy fit with planning, science, everything else we do. That these are not just pixels showing where land was and won't be. This is area that shows where private property was and won't be, where public tax bases are and won't be, where some institutional ownership exists and where individual ownership exists, because institutions and individuals behave differently. They learn differently. You can come up to me and explain all the things that I got wrong, and it's a possibility that I'll learn from it. However, if I were an institution and it was in my charter or my mission statement not to learn what you're trying to teach me, I won't. There are different mechanisms for changing what I can do and how I can accept knowledge. But the institutions and individuals behave differently. And our communities over the last 100 years have become far more institutional, with institutional actors being, and especially ones that have moved away from the local scene. Now, we've talking about managed retreat, but I think it's very, very important to talk about, well, who is the manager? What is being managed and why? And what authority does that manager have, by the way? And what resources go with that ostensible charge? And also, what rights and duties is it going to encounter? Because I can give our friends at the Army Corps of Engineers a brand new mission, like what happened in 1991, where they were told, by the way, think about ecosystem health and enhancement and restoration. And they said, yes, sir. But it didn't make navigation go away. It didn't make traditional flood protection go away. And legally, what you saw up there on that red map was not a flood. It was inundation. And legally, there's a difference between a flood and inundation, particularly for the jurisdiction of certain agencies. Now, maybe in a perfect world, that wouldn't be the case, but we couldn't convince them of that. So it required, essentially, legislative action. Which brings me to the two questions that I think are really important for us to talk about, and that is, so what is the purpose of retreat? And also, who and what will be left behind? Because the purpose, I think, is the central question that often is left unasked and hence unanswered. Because if you're really just trying to move people out of harm's way, well, that's one thing. But are you trying to move people into better places? Are you trying to move communities? Are you trying to enhance or recognize cultural attributes? Are you trying to reward certain strategic objectives? For example, if I'm in Norfolk, Virginia, and we talk relocation, the issue of where does a naval base go is going to come up. Where do the jobs that are centered around that that defense cluster, where do they go? Those are questions that don't come up everywhere, but you need to put those into your purpose, because just saying, let's retreat, doesn't get to that. And it's also important to know that I think there are at least 4 types of retreat that we need to think about. There's retreat for common purpose, and that's where everybody agrees to do it for exactly the same reason. And sometimes if you have a very close-knit community, this is possible. This is rare, but it is possible. Then there's retreat for coordinated purpose, and that's where, well, you don't agree on everything, but you at least most of you agree that there's a sufficiently shared objective that you can, that you can pull your act together and make a difference. To be honest, again, going back to when the Army Corps of Engineers was told to make saving places like South Louisiana their job, it required a remarkable coalition of engaged citizens, not just from Louisiana either. But they didn't all agree on why the coast should be saved or even what a saved coast would look like. Their metric was essentially, will there be enough of a coast for us to argue about 100 years from now? Because to them, that was a sufficient metric of success to begin. But the fishermen had a different objective than the oil and gas guys, who had a different objective than the Native Americans, who had a different objective from the city mayor. It's important to know which one you're talking about. But common purpose and coordinated purposes are still fundamentally looking at centralized actions, government. And that requires authorizing legislation, coordinating missions, and keeping in mind that what you have when you move across jurisdictional boundaries are completely different entities with completely and normally competitive relationships with one another, and whose job is not merely to retreat, it is also, as we've already seen in earlier panels, to encourage growth. There's a bipolar aspect to institutional action here that I think we just have to understand is not merely emotional, it's baked in. And if you want to change it, you have to recognize it. Because most actors, as I think Mark Carney with the Bank of England noted a few years ago, is that this is the tragedy of the horizon, where the things we want to do in the near term don't take cognizance of the trends that are coming in the long and midterm, but they're fundamentally at odds with one another. And one is based on caution, and the other is based upon confidence. If you've read any of Daniel Kahneman's work, you'll know that it's not just capitalism that is driven by overconfidence. It's a whole lot of other things in our lives, including my retirement planning. So I think it's also important to understand that there's retreat for individual purposes and collateral retreat. And those are the ones that I think deserve more attention because that's already happening. There are already plans being made to retreat and to reorganize how you live. And it's not being led by government. It involves government at times. I was driving down the street in New Orleans just the other day thinking about how I'm going to prepare for this talk, and I saw one house being raised up to about 10 feet. It was next to a house raised 8 feet. That was built in the 20s, before we had hurricane levees. And then we have a bunch of other houses not so far, which are pretty much slab on grade. Those reflect different objectives in planning that the owners of those homes are making. The one who's going up to 12 feet is essentially saying, I'm staying. I think I know where water has been, I think I know where water will be, and I'm going to be ahead of it. I know some of the people who have elevated just the minimum, and it's not because they're irrational. They have made the calculated decision that they are willing to flood one more time. And they're going to take their insurance check and leave. They have already planned their retreat. They have funded their retreat, at least in part. That is happening, but most of the people developing plans are not hearing that. They don't know. And what's also happening, and this is where collateral retreat comes in, is that most of the businesses are doing the same thing. Institutional actors, whether it's the archdiocese, whoever owns the local hospital, whoever owns the local hardware stores, which used to be almost all locally owned. But now they are mostly regionally or nationally or internationally owned. And their decisions about where they go and where they leave are based on algorithms. We saw this after Hurricane Katrina, where the real question is, well, would the Home Depot come back? Well, Home Depot doesn't go places where people don't live. But people couldn't come back to live if there was no Home Depot. Same with the hospital, the school, the church. You start understanding that those things are hugely important, and that those are driven by factors that are not always present, but they have legal foundations. It's not that the folks at Home Depot were making the decision about, well, do we like these people or not? Their legal obligation is to their shareholders. They are not legally obliged to be part of your community going forward, any more than automotive plants are obliged to stay in the communities they built cars in for 50 to 100 years. Those are the kinds of things we have to be aware of, that those are the drivers of a lot of planning that's going on, and it's not merely about retreating from water, but it's part of the risk factors that they're putting in. Some of the discussions we've already heard this morning talk about how insurance, and by extension the credit agencies and the credit markets, debt markets, are starting to take cognizance of climate risk and water risk. They're not there to the point where they're really making huge decisions, but again, keep in mind that when someone like Moody's sends a letter to a municipality saying, by the way, we're thinking of counting this in the future, it's not just because they've been reading white papers that we all circulate amongst ourselves. They're trying to avoid legal liability. They don't want to be telling people this is a good investment and then have someone say, well, you ignored this risk. I'm coming back on you. These are the factors that, quite frankly, are going to become more important in understanding how we make conversations amongst stakeholders work. The collateral type of retreat is the one where someone makes a decision for you and your community, and you weren't at the table. Your employer decides to leave. Again, your church decides to close. Or even if you were trying to make a plan for your community, a sustainable plan for how you're going to handle water, but if the largest employer or if the owner of the hospital in your community is not in that room because they're in a different city or a different country, they're part of your community whether you know it or not, because their decision can control the destiny of your community. So you have to find ways of trying to engage them. It's increasingly difficult. In Louisiana, we saw this in spades in communities, after Hurricanes Katrina and Ike, because some of those were the same communities that had been hit hard, a generation or two before in Hurricanes Betsy and Audrey. And the communities came back faster in part because the banks were locally owned. Grocery stores were locally owned. The drugstores were locally owned. It was a different conversation. That's not the world we're in, and it was less insurance-driven. There was no flood insurance at the time of those storms. They led to flood insurance in part. Those are the kinds of things that I think we have to start thinking about. So I'm going to close just by making the plea that the legal landscape, the legal architecture for planning and decision-making is every bit as important as the physical landscape. But it's often ignored. I find, and I don't know how some of the rest of the lawyers in the room feel about this, I'm often the only lawyer in the room where massive decisions are being made about where you might try to build walls or move people or this, that, or the other. There are more lawyers at house closings than there are, but in part because the legal ramifications of the house closing are clear. It's not clear in some of these, and I think it's incumbent upon us, because keep in mind the legal market is normally driven, at least the private sector is waiting for a client to call with a problem that can be solved for which you get a check. This is not that model. We have to find, as lawyers, ways of matching our skill sets with these needs. Otherwise, people will make plans. In the same way that lawyers often write laws that ignore science, ignore culture, and ignore a bunch of things. So I want to make it clear that, first of all, that relocation planning is not relocation. You have all the plans you want. And we have to acknowledge that we have relocated people in communities before, sometimes even for common and coordinated purpose, but it rarely works out real well. We have done the Homestead Act. That was relocation. The Swamplands Act, the Desert Lands Act, which we induced people to live in deserts and swamps. There was a purpose there, maybe not one we want right now, but those are the kinds of things that we have to understand. And also the Resettlement Act in 1935, which was designed to take people out of stressed rural areas, the Dust Bowl, and move them to planned communities. It worked kind of well. It's a little socialistic for many people, but it also was one that had hard-baked social bias built into it. There are things that we can learn from and should. We're not the first to do this. But we should recognize that the prevailing legal and policy architecture already prefers certain outcomes. Those defaults are there, and if we don't like them, we have to make it our business to identify them and figure out how to change them. And that the ultimate test of how well we do this, I think, is going to be measured by who gets left behind, not who gets moved, and what gets left behind. Because there will be those who don't qualify for most of these programs. Renters, poor people, quite frankly, the people who run municipalities, they inherit the problems. New Orleans is a great example. It's a city that is 2/3 the size it was in 1965. But the infrastructure it is managing was designed for a city that was richer and larger. You can say the same thing for Flint, Detroit, any number of other places. We have to understand that every time we talk about moving people, those are some of the consequences of the planned conversation. So we should plan for that too. Thank you.
So now we will hear from Ben Franz Hudson of the University of Oaxaca.
Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. And I'd like to begin by thanking the conference organisers for what has been quite an inspiring conference, albeit depressing on occasions. Labouring away in my office at the bottom of the South Island in New Zealand, it's very easy to feel like you're working in a vacuum and on one's own. So it's wonderful to come and meet so many people who are labouring away at the same issues. So today I'm going to touch on some of the highlights of an interdisciplinary project that I'm just wrapping up, which looks at the legal, planning and social implications of introducing regulation to manage existing land use in hazard areas in New Zealand. So we're comprised of a land use planner, a social scientist and me, a lawyer who has seen the light and joined the Academy. As some of my colleagues from New Zealand have already sort of set up, for those of you who have seen those presentations, New Zealand is a pretty beautiful place. I also thought, because this was the last session of the conference, most of my PowerPoints are just pretty pictures. Although the quid pro quo is you do have to read some legislation in a moment. So we've got high mountains, lakes, amazing beaches, all of which comes at a cost. Our coastline is roughly 15,000 kilometres or 9,300 miles long, which makes it the 9th largest in the world. We've got a population of about 4.5 million people, which from my experience is about the population of the New York subway at any one moment in time. We are seriously exposed to natural hazards generally, such as earthquake, tsunami, tropical cyclone, and the effects of climate change are already being felt with increased occurrences of inundation, flooding and coastal erosion. So like many countries, New Zealand is currently trying to figure out how to manage these risks. And a particularly thorny problem is, how do you manage risk to existing communities? So there's an area near where I live where there are 2,700 homes which are built on what was once a low-lying coastal wetland. And the water table is very close to the surface. So if you look straight ahead, that is South Dunedin. On the left is what is currently a peninsula, but probably by the time my children have children may well be an island. So how to reduce the risk to these sorts of homes is a major issue in my community, and there are no easy answers. Because it's one thing to address risk when considering a new development, and it's quite another to address risk in relation to a community that's already there, especially when that risk is already increasing. So there are no feasible engineering solutions that will solve the problem in my hometown. And in order to solve the problem, we think we're going to have to look to engineering's partner, land use planning. So planning to reduce existing risks requires the ability to manage existing uses of land. So in some cases that might involve relatively minor actions, such as controlling the way properties are rebuilt following a disaster, so where they're rebuilt on the site or at what level of height they're rebuilt to. And in others it might involve the major step of extinguishing an existing use completely. And in that context, depopulation, or as we've been talking about, managed retreat, is an option. And we've abandoned the term managed retreat for many of the reasons that have been raised in this conference. So our research focused on the planning possibilities or impossibilities of reducing risk through managing existing land use under New Zealand's primary piece of planning legislation, the Resource Management Act 1991. So the RMA, as it is usually known, provides an integrated approach to resource management. The Act creates two different levels of local government agency: regional councils and district or territorial authorities. And it also sets up a hierarchy of planning instruments. And the plans made at the district level generally deal with things such as the effects of land use and subdivision. plans made at the regional level generally address issues such as discharges of contaminants to land, air and water. And sitting above those plans are various national instruments which give some national direction and occasionally binding policy to the lower order councils and planning instruments. In relation to hazards and risks, there's very limited national guidance, and so local government is stuck with the basic provisions in the legislation, which have been substantially the same since 1991. So our research has highlighted several challenges in the hazard and risk space, and I'm just going to touch on some of them. But a key problem with the Act is that the whole scheme is not designed around risk, but it's designed around hazards. So, for example, one of the specified functions of regional councils under the Act is to control the use of land for the avoidance or mitigation of natural hazards. So this immediately means that the focus is on the hazard rather than the risk posed by the hazard. And this reflects the fact that New Zealand's understanding of how to articulate and approach risk is really only developing, and I think we're a bit of an outlier in that sense. Certainly risk-based planning could be described best as emergent. However, the consequence of that is that the language of and outcomes for risk within the scheme is inconsistent. And this means that for local government there is no clear path in terms of their responsibilities to manage risk and their options for do so. And this is compounded by a lack of definitions and metrics, which leaves each individual local authority having to come up with their own. And our research also suggests that they don't understand what it actually means to reduce risk. So we spoke to many people who were convinced that they were holding the line by not allowing the risk to get any worse, but our analysis actually showed that what they were doing wouldn't even achieve that, particularly in situations such as sea level rise, where the incidence or the probability and the magnitude of the risk is actually increasing over time. So overall, our assessment here is that when it comes to managing the risk posed to existing development, these issues lead to a lack of clarity and because of that, a lack of action. And moreover, there's no clear mandate to reduce risk at all, and so there's no imperative to act. And further difficulties flow from the decision that was made when the RMA was established to return to the common law position that a person can undertake any activity on their land that they wish unless it's controlled by a lawful restraint. And this has created a real reluctance to interfere with what are seen as sacrosanct private property rights. But of course this leads to a sort of looming conflict with risk reduction, which will necessitate changing the way that people have been living, or indeed their ability to continue living in an area at all. So a key question for us was whether or not it was even possible to extinguish existing uses under the Resource Management Act. And in this area there are two critical sections. So Section 10 protects existing uses by indicating that no rule in a district plan can modify and extinguish an existing use. So if you've been running a kindergarten for 20 years and there's a new rule that says kindergartens have to have car parks, you don't have to worry about implementing car parks because you can carry on with your existing use. So as a result, territorial authorities have got no power to change existing uses of land, and so they can't achieve any level of risk reduction with regard to existing communities. In contrast, Section 20A indicates that regional councils, so the next level up the hierarchy, can impose rules that will require people to seek permission to carry on undertaking an existing activity. And that activity might come with conditions, or that permission might come with conditions that can reduce risk. And such rules can also prohibit activities altogether. So it's feasible for a regional council to require that a house be rebuilt to a particular height to reduce the effects of inundation, or to adopt a rule that prohibits the ongoing use of land for residential purposes at all, in effect imposing a managed retreat or a depopulation. So ultimately, it is possible under the RMA to extinguish existing uses in order to reduce risk. However, there is an immediate governance problem because the regional councils who have the power do not usually impose land use rules. They're normally worried about discharges to air and to water. In contrast, the imposition of land use rules normally falls to district councils, also known as territorial authorities. But in addition to that problem, there is an overlapping jurisdiction, as the Act says that both regional and territorial governments are responsible for controlling land use to manage natural hazards. So we have a major governance issue between the different levels of local government. And the historical record suggests that they were supposed to cooperate, but there is no capacity-based support within the legislation. And what we've seen is a great deal of hesitation on both sides for either one to engage with what they see as the responsibility of someone else. Beyond the issues of governance, the fact that any act to extinguish an existing use will interfere with a private property right is never very far away. And this approach colours both the legislation and the range of decisions which are seen as being permissible by local government. So we have no written constitution. There is no Fifth Amendment protecting private property. There is a presumption that goes back to Magna Carta that the state will only take away property when it's empowered by Parliament and with compensation, but it can do it if it wants to. The RMA itself complicates things by dealing with regulatory takings by noting in Section 85 that an interest in land shall be deemed not to be taken or injuriously affected by reason of any provision in a plan. So technically, this would mean that if you had a rule to reduce existing risk, perhaps by saying, well, you can't live there anymore, then you could get that through. And it would be a regulation provision in a plan, so it would not attract compensation. There is, however, an exception, and where the rule would render the land incapable of reasonable use, and that would be unfair and unreasonable, then three things can happen. The authority can either change the provision, abandon the provision, or acquire the land, but they can only acquire the land if the landowner consents. So the lawyers in the room will be having a fit at this stage because what each of those things is totally unclear. Is a rule that says you can't live somewhere because it's unsafe rendering the land incapable of reasonable use, or is it the hazard that's rendering the land incapable of reasonable use? What's the distinction between unfair and unreasonable? So I've got a career here, but our ultimate conclusion is that you might be able to get through Section 85 if the risk is high and fairly immediate. So an earlier presentation talked about an area called Matata where there is a risk of landslip, debris flow that could result in loss of life. It's possible in that situation that you might be able to get through Section 85, but you would need something like that, and it makes it very difficult in terms of planning for long-term hazards such as sea level rise, because it might well be unreasonable to tell people they have to move away from their land if you don't know when the sea is going to encroach, and it might be 10 or 20 or 30 years down the track. The paradox that we've found, though, is that although it might be possible to do it where there's a high risk, local government is very hesitant to consider it at the moment, seeing it as a tool of last resort, and will only use it when all other mitigation options have been seen as being exhausted. Conversely, they are quite happy to begin thinking about it where the problem is not for some time in the future. Where we would suggest that they don't actually have the power to think about it at the moment. I'm running out of time. The other sort of highlight for me has been the fact that as a lawyer being involved in this, it's been really good to be able to point out to people that none of this policy stuff happens in a vacuum. You can't, even if you've got a great policy, if it's going to interfere with people's private property rights, then there's 1,000 years worth of ways of approaching private property that judges in particular will be extremely mindful of when interpreting the legislation, and that is really unavoidable. So overall, I think that what it demonstrates is that strong and good legislative frameworks are crucial in order to facilitate addressing managed retreat. And from my legal perspective, these good legislative frameworks operate to create understanding, and they also provide both the ability and the imperative to act. And where interagency cooperation is required, they also help to clarify roles and, where possible, provide structures for collaborative endeavours. And I'm sure that my colleagues would stress that once you have a good legislative framework, it's also necessary to consider how to translate those directives into policies and rules. And perhaps most importantly, harking back to the first session in this conference, work out how to appropriately engage with the communities affected so that they have ownership of the decisions that are made about the risks that affect them. And I think with that I'm out of time. But thank you.
So I'm going to invite Ben Orlov from Columbia University to come up.
Sure. Well, I'm very glad to be here and glad to see so many people here after several very full days. Appreciate your attention. And want to thank the organizers certainly as well. And so talking here about an international context, and there's not precisely international law, though there are various international agreements. So that does connect with the law, and so there'll be some of the interactions of law present here, though I myself am an anthropologist. And was looking initially at these two international organizations, and we'll be hearing about a third as well, seeing how they interact. And let's see, maybe I push. These emphasizing that these forums provide a context for discussion of managed retreat. We're certainly aware that climate change is a global problem. Sea level rise is a global problem. Sea level rise is not completely uniform. There are some places where the rate is higher or lower, and there are different factors on land. But it's really a global problem, and the concentration of populations in coastal zones and in coastal cities certainly international as well, and it's one with consequences as well for an international system, for trade, for migration, for conflict, and so something that attracts international attention, opportunities for sharing information, for crafting common solutions. So one of the points that's striking is that this has been noticed for the past 30 years, though we have the sense here at the conference of many things being new. It's a problem that these international forums have looked at for quite some time. We'll see that perhaps they haven't been moving or advancing as quickly as they might have. There has been growth in attention, and I think that's part of what's happening. We're quite international here, and I think reflecting that. You'll see that there's a lot of general discussion of the topic of managed retreat, and yet so often here in the conference we've really been drilling down to what's happening in specific locations, of very striking talks here of the rich texture of what's happening in New Orleans or New Zealand. That isn't necessarily reflected in these. They're remaining at a higher level, and or a more abstract level. Some reasons for that. There also have been some networks of cities that have become active, and they particularly circulate concrete plans. That's one place where the sharing is taking place. So it's an interesting question of how these two major climate organizations which coexist and are linked, what is their level of articulation with the international networks of cities, and it's not particularly tight. And that, I think, is an interesting fact. Being interested in all of this the goal is to address these questions, but it is very striking to look at these frameworks. So there are 2 UN-based climate organizations. They developed around the same time, came out of these major international climate conferences, going back 40 years when climate change was really emerging as an issue. So the first was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so this is a group that produces assessment reports, and they're produced with a certain frequency. Assessment reports are a certain kind of document. They're very well established. There are some that date back to the early 20th century, though they're largely a phenomenon of after World War II. So there's a very orderly way to scope information and to just report on knowledge. So this is reporting on observations, on projections. It's knowledge-based. That complements the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is an organization that was designed to come up with agreements. The Framework Convention allows other agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol on the Paris Agreement. So they have meetings. They also meet on a regular basis. These conferences of parties are yearly. So this is drawing on a much older tradition of international treaties and diplomacy. So they also produce documents, they produce agreements, and these are also heavily constrained, but these are the political international agreements. So there are these big meetings, tens of thousands of people every year at the United Nations conferences of parties, as opposed to the hundreds of experts who gather more periodically, producing the knowledge. So the knowledge and the agreements, one is fact, one is social decisions to act. They really have come to complement each other. Each kind of counts on the other. The UNFCCC looks to the IPCC for reports. The IPCC is eager has to be objective, has to be policy relevant, but policy neutral. So we'll see what they say. And then these organizations of cities that have a very different kind of history popping up in different ways. United Nations turns its worried eye towards cities in 1978. ICLEI is a group of a lot of smaller cities from the 90s. Then there's kind of led by some mayors is the C40, which now has 90 members in the 100 resilient cities, promoted by foundations. These are all international. These are different scale cities, different purposes, but they have city administrators and planners meeting and talking often quite concretely. So here's a time chart, a timeline. We can turn to it here. You'll see that that's the IPCC on the bottom and the UNFCCC on the top. And so these are just some major points. And so you see early on the IPCC recognizes what we've been hearing here, that retreat is one of the measures, along with sort of reinforcement and then kind of accommodation. So they've talked about that, but it has been going on. So it appeared early, and it kind of continues. In contrast, we see that the UNFCCC also started talking quite early about adaptation, recognizing that it couldn't just reduce greenhouse gases through mitigation, but it also had to address the changes that are coming. And so this was framed early on. The IPCC in 1996 began to distinguish internal and international migration, something that we've been hearing about quite a bit here, that most of we're aware of the impacts of the whole question of people who are displaced by climate or who are climate migrants or climate refugees. So we then get, takes a while for the UNFCCC, it's in 1999 that they mention managed retreat in the context of a technical paper on coastal issues. Here I think there's a tendency to look more broadly at adaptation, to look at international funding of adaptation perhaps, and not necessarily to drill down into the details. The IPCC then does discuss begins to recognize greater importance of managed retreat in 2001, talking about moving away from hard protection strategies. 2007, you see some discussion of land use relocation and land acquisition. So these terms come forward. What's important in 2007 at COP13 in Bali for the UNFCCC is this thing called loss and damage. So if you think of managed retreat possibly as a kind of adaptation, this is the UNFCCC recognizing that if mitigation is avoiding the unmanageable, and adaptation is managing the unavoidable, there are some things that are neither manageable nor avoidable. There are just going to be some problems. There are going to be losers. There are going to be things we can't fix. And so that is the whole area of loss and damage. What are we going to do about that? There are a number of very vulnerable countries that have promoted that, and that brings attention certainly to sea level rise, something that's just, it's inexorable nature and its tight links to greenhouse gas concentrations, places it in the agenda of these international groups, but we're left thinking, is retreat a form of adaptation, or is it a sign of the limits of adaptation? And that gets, that's gotten people kind of tied up in knots and makes it kind of hard to address. So we see again, Cancun very forward, one of the more active COPs talked about planned relocation, but since then there's been discussion of more movement on loss and damage. It kind of doesn't go away, but it doesn't get fully addressed, but it doesn't really go away. And so we're also beginning to see some more discussion of managed retreat in the most recent IPCC assessment report. The new, the sixth assessment report is now underway. There are the various lead author meetings. The first draft of the sixth assessment report will be open for expert comment late this year. So if any of you seek to see greater attention to managed retreat in the sixth assessment report, just follow the IPCC site, and when the report becomes open for expert comment, you can submit your names, and likely you'll be accepted, and you'll get to see the drafts. There will be chapters on cities, chapters on the coast, regional chapters, and you'll be able to comment. And if you think the discussion of managed retreat is insufficient, you can insert your comment, and that must be addressed. So this is some of the keyword frequencies. You can see this is looking at the working group 2, that's the physical sciences first. Working group 1, energy, is working group 3. Working group 2 is impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And you can see that there's some discussion of the word retreat, which these reports come out from late 1990s to the present every 5-6 years. You can see that there is increase overall to these issues, though the word retreat doesn't appear all that often. This is in the report that has lots of details on regions and sectors. If you look at the synthesis reports that tie all three reports together, you also see that there's some initial interest and then recent increase, but once again, the word retreat doesn't pop up all that often. If you look at this keyword frequency in the UNFCCC COP declarations, the main thing you see is that displacement really pops up. Otherwise, there's a little bit of discussion of coast and migration, but it's really displacement that's hugely coming to attention now, and that a lot of that, I think, is certainly a lot of it's connected to coasts, but different from retreat. The cities, I'll just say briefly, start talking about retreat a little bit later. There's different groups. 2007 is the first appearance, and then the word comes up again. But I think retreat is always one of multiple issues, and typically not the one that gets the most attention. So I have a few general points here. Strategic retreat comes up early. IPCC reviewing, trying to sort of, the IPCC, in its effort to review, to assess a broad range of policy options, will mention strategic retreat. UNFCCC has begun to address it, though not as extensively. And this international organizations of cities are paralleling as well. The sea level rise is certainly a major topic of interest. It's something that the science continues to advance, and so it's a good match for the science to impacts to policy nature of the IPCC. And the IPCC is really trying not just to assess impacts of climate change, have we detected them, are they taking place, can we attribute them to greenhouse gases, but to talk about responses. So they like this word responses, we've heard about solutions, that's one. But they sort of want to kind of slice and dice the different ways of describing how people move around the world, so managed retreat doesn't necessarily get that much attention. UNFCCC, which had started off talking about mitigation as its principal object, has looked a lot at adaptation. I think the discussion, we have this question of whether planned retreat kind of adaptation or a sign of limits to adaptation is not just splitting hairs, because it has quite a bit to do with financing. So if there are international finance arrangements, what activities can they support, who's putting the money in, and how is it distributed? And so we're certainly hearing a lot about the financing of a managed retreat, and though there will be considerable sums available, are becoming available for adaptation internationally, how do they fit in to managed retreat is certainly a question. And so the mobility is kind of a way to handle these highly sensitive questions. The cities are often less systematic, though they have case studies, and so you see studies of one city or another, something about Norfolk, Virginia, or Da Nang in Vietnam, cities that are seen as being active. These organizations serve to circulate the plans, and I think generally inspire other cities as much as providing very concrete details. So we're seeing, I think you can see these points here, that there's an awareness of strategic retreat. It's linked with other questions of mobility, of planning, of response, doesn't emerge neatly. And there's this diversity of terms. I think there's that same discomfort and uncertainty in the international organizations that there is here in Green Hall these last 3 days. So those are my points, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, and now we'll hear from Carlos Martin of the Urban Institute.
All right. Yep. Let's end this show. Good afternoon, everybody. My name, as was mentioned, is actually Carlos Eduardo Martin, and let's see, let's get mine. Yeah, shoot. As everybody sees me fiddling with the, yeah, here we go. Good, so it's always a challenge to, what? Slideshow. Let's do this one instead. All right, thank you, Anna. It's always difficult to go from the divine discussion about what's happening on the globe to the profane of what's happening in the U.S., but I will try my best. So as we've discussed over the last 2 days, there is really no national program for a comprehensive managed retreat in this country. But there are many examples of federal relocation policies and legal precedents that shed light on what can be done and what should not be done. So this paper is really coming out of a discussion that I've had with colleagues at the Urban Institute in the fair housing world and in housing mobility programs to look at what sort of combination, what kind of grab bag of pre-existing relocation policies have existed and what legal precedents will determine how we may conceive of a managed retreat kind of program. So like I mentioned, it's a bit of a grab bag. The best thing that I could do is kind of lump these programs into two piles. So one is legislation and executive branch programs, and the other will be legal precedents. So let me talk a little bit more about the first. And this I'm kind of interested in breaking out from property owners to renters, what kind of relocation world we live in. Starting with the Uniform Relocation Act from the 1970s, which was a backlash to, of course, all of the urban redevelopment that was occurring in the 60s and earlier in the 70s, through the Gautreaux and moving to opportunity programs of the 1970s through the 1990s, and then the Hope 6 and Choice relocation services in the 1990s and beyond. So again, this is sort of the grab bag of federal programs as well as legislation that have some role in in determining relocation policies. I'm sorry, I've had allergies all day, and so I'm going back and forth. So, as we know, the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states that the private property shall not be taken without payment of just compensation, and that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So that combined with the creation in 1965 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of a mission, a cabinet level mission to ensure that all Americans have safe and decent housing, have created a variety of different sort of scenarios in which we can conceive of relocation programs similar to the ones we've been talking about over the last 2 days. So let's talk about the Uniform Relocation Act first. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Uniform Relocation Act, there's sort of a quick blurb that I've listed up there. Somebody was raising their hand as if they knew what the Relocation Act is. So, thank you for acknowledging that. The big points that I want to pull off from this are that it requires uniform, fair, and equitable treatment of persons. So treatment of persons is a very complicated description in many HUD programs, specifically in the Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery. The description of fair compensation has been particularly contested. As we know, partners that I've been working with in New Orleans, the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, were the leading claimants in a lawsuit against HUD and the Louisiana Recovery Act after Katrina because of the unfair pricing of African American owned households in the New Orleans area in comparison to white, higher priced households that obviously due to redlining and segregation histories were priced higher than the African American households. So giving fair market value at the time of the hurricane's landing, obviously, and just exacerbated that distortion. That, of course, was settled in 2008. A second point that I want to particularly call out is this idea of encouraging voluntary acquisitions and buyouts. So the URA is very particular about distinguishing between jurisdictions that have eminent domain authority and those that do not have eminent domain authority. In both cases, there can be voluntary acquisition and buyouts. For a jurisdiction with eminent domain authority, voluntary in those cases means that there is no specific site that the jurisdiction, the state, the city wants to take over. So it's sort of like allowing for a voluntary selection of, or sort of almost random arbitrary selection of a property. And the other requirements that for an eminent jurisdiction that does not have eminent domain authority are somewhat similar then to the additional requirements are very similar to those that do have the eminent domain authority. That is that the property owner has to be informed in writing of the fair market value of their home, of their property. The agency must inform the owner in writing that the property may be acquired, and that if there are tenants in the property that they will be displaced and the tenants are provided some sort of relocation assistance. So ultimately what we learned from the URA is that there are relocation funds, if there are relocation funds associated with relocation in any way, and federal funds associated with relocation funds in any way, it's legally defined, and sort of the purchase price and fair compensation could be done well for properties if accurately planned. Okay, so let's move on to renters. So for those who aren't familiar with Gautreaux, Gautreaux was the program that moved thousands of Chicago families who were in public housing or on waiting lists for public housing assistance to other neighborhoods in and around Chicago. It began in 1976, and it ended in the late 1990s with an additional quick wave, and that took place in 2002. The Moving to Opportunity was the national version of the Gautreaux experiments in Chicago. The Moving to Opportunity started in the 1990s. And similar to Gautreaux, MTO provided thousands of families with an opportunity to receive a voucher to move to a more affluent neighborhood. So a key distinguishing factor between Gautreaux and MTO was that Gautreaux was primarily focused on racial desegregation, and MTO was explicitly focused on deconcentration of poverty. So the categories of difference were somewhat different there. But the key points we want to take away from this are that assisted housing mobility initiatives always assumed that families will, one, want to move to better locations given their motivations and the information about choices that they are offered. Two, that they will be able to move given counseling, search assistance, and other supports. 3, that they will be able to stay in the new location long enough to benefit from that relocation, given the resources that they've been able to acquire, as well as housing, the specific housing market conditions in which they're going to, and any post-move supports that they receive. Also, that they will be able to take advantage of the new locations, given any other external supports that they receive. And over time, that many will experience significant net benefits compared with similar families that did not get the opportunity to move. And in fact, randomized controlled trials, experiments of both have demonstrated that that is actually the case. Families that were given the vouchers and were with additional assistance in moving had significantly lower poverty rates and moved to neighborhoods with lower crime rates, et cetera. So there are a variety of lessons to be learned from these kinds of mobility programs, but there are 4 key lessons I want to make sure that we take away from these. The first is that costs matter. So low-income households often face chronic and more severe housing instability. Housing stability exists along a continuum from being stably and affordably housed to being overcrowded or behind on rent, involuntarily or frequently moved or homeless. While the goal is to move families to greater stability and keep them there, many low-income households have a cumulative history of instability working against them. So for households, unaffordable housing costs, where they may be going to, may be their biggest barrier to greater stability and opportunity. Second, timing matters. So low-income households are also more likely to experience negative circumstances that push them to move, so that give them the motivation to want to move. We're obviously talking about a very particular negative circumstance when it comes to a hazard or a potentially chronic hazard, such as the effects of climate change. But events such as household dissolution, job loss, and economic insecurity, domestic violence even, can occur suddenly and require a rapid move. So wherever they're moving to, there have to be the supports around that to ensure that there is stability associated with the move in which they've taken. Third, the types of assistance matter. So I've mentioned this a couple times already, but relocation assistance is much more involved than we have been given, that has been given some attention to in the past 2 days. Housing mobility counseling can help, but then also the adequate services once somebody has gotten to their point of relocation. Are those angels calling me? Where it says bounce? Is it already my time? Okay. Over my speech. No, okay. Let me go quickly. I'm not going. Fourth, place matters. So not only clearly do the kinds of assistance that are given, but clearly moving to a place where there are the opportunities for that household to thrive, the educational opportunities, the employment opportunities, et cetera. So we have to have place-conscious strategies as well. Let me go on. So we talked about owners with the Uniform Relocation Act. We talked about renters with assistance in GATRO and MTO. So now let's talk about public housing residents, so another segment of the housed population. So the HOPE 6 program, as many of you know, that's just my, I was like, nobody really wants to hear this speech, do they? Okay, now let me continue. This was started by the Urban Revitalization Demonstration in 1993. As a result, HOPE 6 was created to redevelop large-scale public housing developments into mixed-income, occasionally mixed-use housing developments. And so they're controversial for a lot of different reasons. The early HOPE 6 programs didn't do one-for-one matches, for example, for the existing public housing residents, but in all cases, there was a movement of residents, albeit temporarily in some cases, but in many cases it was a full displacement of them. So one of the unique features of HOPE 6 is that it explicitly required that a substantial portion of funds be earmarked for resident supportive services, it's called the soft side of HOPE 6. The original legislation set 20% of the initial $300 million appropriation for those kind of community supportive services. Providing effective relocation services was part of that, and is perhaps the most difficult challenge in implementing HOPE 6 and its consequential. It was named choice after the change in administration. A number of factors affect the success of relocation efforts. For example, the quality of relocation services, the local housing options. One of the things we haven't heard about sufficiently is the housing markets in which people are being relocated to, the relocatee preferences and barriers, and private market constraints for them. So those are the policy and legislation bucket that that I wanted to talk about. Now let me talk about a couple of legal precedents as well. So the first is what happens, whether government can sort of force relocations. And so many of you are already familiar with the famous Kelo versus City of New London Act, which affirmed the role of eminent domain in the U.S. I'd like to talk about the next two cases, because it's not about when the government does get involved, it's when the government doesn't get involved. Now, it's important to note that both of these cases were around physical infrastructure and not about housing or particular properties. But the Jordan v. St. Johns County in Florida State, the state ruled that government inaction in the face of a duty to act could form the basis for a takings claim. Basically, as a jurisdiction where the roads got washed out every year, the county decided we're not going to keep building these roads to get to these houses because it costs too much. So there was a lawsuit saying that no, you must. That would constitutes taking. You cannot take our. You must act and continuously service these roads. I'm being very quick because I am out of time. The second, the St. Bernard County Parish case is it was through the federal. Appeals Court in the U.S. Ruled that government inaction does not take a takings claim, but that it was actually a tort claim. So both of these cases are still working their ways out, and I'm guessing some of my colleagues who are lawyers are going to talk about them a little bit more. But in both of these cases, what we really learn is that, let me be a flip, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. So we've already talked about the kinds of programs that are affected by these, FEMA's buyout programs, CDBGDR's buyout and acquisition programs. But I do want to sort of just quickly pull out. So how does precedents affect these terms? So buyouts versus acquisitions basically determines whether you're managing the environment as much as you're managing the people. Private ownership versus rental occupancy determines if you're managing how you manage different types of populations, right? Temporary location versus permanent location determines whether you're accounting for the range of needs that the population is going to have in the longer term and what those needs are, how you're assessing those needs. So to the previous list of suits, I do want to include the 2015 Supreme Court ruling on the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project. This is known as the disparate impact rule, which prohibits policies that produce segregation even if those policies weren't intended to produce segregation. So it suggests that there's that inaction among federal government can also be applicable in the housing residential side. So the big lessons I want you to take away from here: one, it's going to cost a lot of money to do managed retreat. Two, that there are legal rules and program precedents for managing relocation. Three, that there aren't appropriate services currently set up for climate-specific relocation. And four, the flippant, if government doesn't get involved, there may be lawsuits. If government does get involved, there may be lawsuits. But inaction, of course, is unreasonable, it's inefficient, and ultimately it's immoral. So we have to figure out a way to get there. That's it.
As potentially noted by Carlos, we're going to be spending the next 15 minutes talking about roads. And this actually came out of a 4-year project started in 2015. And I'd like to say thank you to all of the funders, first of all, for being able to do this very collaborative project. NOAA and the Sea Grants for Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina funded a participatory process to build local government capacity in essentially hazard recognition and in understanding the legal and policy factors that might impact adaptation actions by those local municipalities. And I'm specifically going to be discussing one piece of the legal analysis today. And there was a great team working on the legal side. Those are all of the wonderful people on the right. It was a fantastic opportunity to work with all of them. in the coastal southeast, one of the issues, as noted, especially in Florida, but also throughout the southeast, one of the issues that we're dealing with on the municipal level is roads. And there are a lot of climate impacts on roads. And these will make maintaining roads significantly more costly over time. And you can have additional and unexpected failures. All of these things basically lead to the conclusion that as we're looking at maintaining roads or building new coastal infrastructure, we really need to understand future environmental risks to the best extent possible. But for that to happen, all of the various public and private entities that go into transportation infrastructure would need to understand climate change, potential climate change impacts, admit, which in North Carolina for a long time we were not, that those climate change impacts were actually occurring, and build that into the infrastructure design and planning processes. Some states are in a better position to do that than others. However, that doesn't change the fact that many of our roads are very susceptible to coastal flooding. Who owns the roads, and therefore who has a responsibility for them, is therefore going to be a major issue. In our study area, these 4 states, the vast majority of the roads are either state or locally owned. You'll notice that the federal government actually has a relatively small percentage of total road miles in coastal southeast states. And so the challenge there is, if somebody other than the federal government owns the roads, what does that mean? What we found is that there is significant differences state to state. So you'll notice in North Carolina, you basically don't have counties owning roads. It is either the state or the actual municipality. In other states, you have the county governments have a significant amount of the road mileage that they are responsible for. So it's highly variable, even within some geographic area that would be considered similar. And of course, this is critical to understanding who has a duty to act when there is some issue with the road. So who actually has authority, who has a duty? And why does that matter? Well, it matters for a couple different reasons. The first is that we do planning around infrastructure at different levels. And so who actually has the responsibility, who has the authority to deal with that infrastructure is going to impact which planning processes should be used to deal with it. And our analysis leads us to conclude that even if a governmental entity wanted to make a proactive, adaptive choice, if they wanted to repair a road, elevate a road, abandon a road, the laws as they exist may make that very difficult based on whether they have the authority to take each of those individual actions. And state and local governments do have a duty to maintain roads. When they fail to do that, they can be liable for a number of different claims. And the choice then makes it so that they are often caught between a rock and a hard place, or between the ocean and a lake, right? Because if they choose to not maintain this road, if they choose to abandon the road, that could lead to a takings claim. But if they don't continue to maintain the road and yet don't abandon it, they can be sued for that too. So it's difficult for local municipalities to know how they should actually go about making adaptive choices in their infrastructure. But so how could realistically they get sued? First of all, I recognize there are a lot of non-lawyers. I am not going to be able to get in depth into this. There is a 60-something page law review article I will give you at the site at the end. You are happy to read it. It's very compelling. But basically, what causes of actions can people bring against municipalities for not maintaining a road? Well, they can try to compel the municipality to do something. That actually, in all 4 of our states, a citizen can actually put a writ of mandamus petition together. They can try to compel action because doing nothing is causing harm. And this is potentially before major harm has occurred. More likely, their lack of action, not maintaining the road, has caused harm. We saw examples of negligent actions against municipalities in various states. So that is actually already occurring. And if the action is taken to abandon a road, then you could end up with takings claims. We have started to see some foundation work for that in the courts already. We don't have a case that has bubbled all the way up and received a strong ruling, but certainly there are indications that private property groups are laying the foundation for those cases to come up through the court system. Now, of course, if we're talking about negligence, that what you didn't do about the road caused harm, for that to be an action that is successful, you have to have duty, breach, causation, and damages. So the municipality has to have some sort of a duty that they then breached, which caused a harm, and there were damages because of that harm. This is, again, we're already seeing these cases, but what actually the states have to do to make it so that they are not liable in negligence varies. And there's no really clear case law that spans the 4 states around when a lack of action will count as negligence and when it will not. Now, states and municipalities do have one thing going for them here. What actually is the duty that they have? Duties are very state specific. There is not a common duty across around something like coastal infrastructure and roads. And so these actions can actually be made worse by the fact that in many of our municipalities, multiple people may own authority for a particular segment of road in very short distances. So you might have the state government own a small chunk of it, and then the municipality owns a piece of it, and then the county government might own even more. So that makes it a challenge because every single one of those different layers in a state may have a different duty around infrastructure. Even if you have a duty and you're a municipality, you actually might be able to get away from a negligence action through sovereign immunity. And in sovereign immunity, it basically forbids courts to entertain lawsuits against a state without the consent of that state. However, what it applies to, again, varies state by state. So in North Carolina, it doesn't apply to road maintenance. So if you have just not maintained a road, you can't actually claim sovereign immunity against a lawsuit for that. In North Carolina and in South Carolina, where improper maintenance caused flood hazards, then knowing about the hazard seemed to make a difference. And again, we don't have a huge number of cases at this point, but we're seeing a trend in this direction. So what would actually make it so that the state would no longer have any of these duties and wouldn't have to worry about sovereign immunity applying? You could abandon the road. Now, how do you abandon a road? If you haven't guessed, it varies state by state. The standard that's used to determine whether a road can be abandoned is also highly variable. So, for example, in North Carolina, the municipality has to look and see if any adjacent landowner would be deprived of a reasonable means of access. Now, do we have a great, perfect definition of what reasonable means of access is? No, of course not, right? So that would be litigated if somebody came forward and said, I want my municipality to not abandon this road. On the other hand, if you're looking at Georgia, it's just that the road no longer serves a substantial public purpose, or abandoning the road is in the best public interest. Is that a lot easier to meet if you're a municipality and you're spending 40% of your road maintenance dollars on one particular stretch of oceanfront road? Yes, right? So depending on where you are, you as a municipality could have a very different standard that you would have to meet to go about the process of abandoning infrastructure that is no longer viable. Of course, if you go through the process and abandon a road, the challenge may be a taking. And we are starting again to see these in the context of sea level rise, coastal erosion, and where municipalities are attempting to remove infrastructure or services from specific properties. And basically, these say or claim that because the municipality is no longer providing access or a service, that a taking has occurred, and therefore the owner of that property should be compensated for the difference in price. Now, of course, the challenge is that in many cases, or at least some of the ones that we're starting to see, the reason that the municipality is not working at reconstructing a road is because it is now in the public trust. And there are other regulations that make it so that you can't put paved tarmac on public trust lands. So where this is going to go is certainly a developing situation, but it's something that municipalities need to recognize is happening. Where do we go from here? Very quickly, in the law review article, we said we need to adopt a resilience standards in the maintenance of road systems. We need to actually look at how we can abandon roads without a takings liability. And we need to go ahead and reform those duties to deal with these huge inconsistencies that we see across state, county, city patchworks. That is where articles are. So thank you very much to Columbia Journal of Environmental Law for publishing the long 60-something page law review article where we've put all of this together. If you're interested in individual state pieces, those are hosted at the georgiacoast.uga.edu site. And we're also continuing to look at other infrastructure, especially the issues around septic systems and sewers, because we are also already seeing those very much affected by extreme weather and sea level rise in this coastal area, and they have likewise extremely difficult legal challenges associated with them. So thank you, and it's been a great conference.
So if you could come on up here, I did not have to deploy the trap door. We have 5 minutes for questions. Any questions?
I guess that's a question for Peter. From my experience in several communities, or many communities, roads are also the pathway for water distribution systems, sewer systems, and above ground communication and power. So is that a further complication, because the road may be owned by the local community, but the sewer system may be the county or some other jurisdiction? So have you come across any insights what further complications that produces?
So interestingly, a lot of the communities that we looked at have chosen for various reasons to have septic systems instead of sewer systems. So yes, on the water infrastructure, but easements for water lines don't always, especially in these geographies, what we found don't always follow the roadway systems. And I don't know why that was the case. It might have just been the specific communities. I mean, we looked at basically one community for that in each state. So it might be these specific communities. And I'm most familiar with Nags Head, North Carolina. I do see that as being a challenge going forward, especially as you have to start turning off parts of those systems. That's one of the other things that we've been looking at, is how do you stop providing water service when it doesn't make sense to try to keep moving part of that infrastructure back away from the coast in like little tiny chunks. And that's a really, really difficult and thorny legal question that we did not come up with a good answer to.
Another question.
Yeah, my question is for Ben Orlov. So I'm right here, to your right. Yeah. I was curious about. So C40 is one of those networks that you included in your presentation, and I was curious as to whether there are discussions and exchanges of best practices among members of C40, and in particular, I'm interested in the idea as to whether under authoritarian regimes, what managed retreat can be. And I know that some of the new members of C40 include China, which has a different way of governing. So yeah, my question is, do in these forums where democratic societies and authoritarian societies exchange ideas and best practices, do they exchange best ideas and best practices about managed retreat, heavy-handed managed retreat, perhaps?
So I'm not deeply familiar. I'm not deeply familiar with that. So this has just been looking at their documents, and they certainly use a language that makes cities seem very comparable. They have similar ways of discussing their threats, and there's a very general governance language they use. And so they are talking about movement. Beyond that, so whether that's just kind of a very, though we kind of criticize, there's been a lot of criticism of the managerial approaches and the discomfort with the management, there are other words that come in like participation and engagement that also get to circulate, and these are words that are inevitably imprecise, but you can hope that these allow a certain kind of, perhaps they allow a certain kind of opening. And it'd be fascinating to document how it works out, and someone who actually might know something about this.
No, I'm just saying that's really interesting. Yeah. It's really
I guess if I can add to that, so in the interest of full disclosure, I'm the principal investigator of the 100RC monitoring and evaluation. And there's a reluctance of cities to talk about managed retreat for a variety of reasons, primarily revenue and tax based, right? So, these interventions are city-based, they're not regional-based, so it's not like there's ability to move that easily within their own city if they're talking about managed retreat. But in many cases, I think the difference is between practices for developing context versus developed context. So in C40 tends to be developed cities, and 100RC has both developing and developed cities. So in the developing context, it's under the guise of informal settlement upgrading, which there's a history, a 30-year history in the World Bank and the UN of doing that kind of services. So it's a combination of resettlement and upgrading. And in the developed context, for the reason I already mentioned, that there's a sort of a tax-based issue that is a fear.
So we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists for a terrific discussion.